Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it cost a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. Quite a sad day for us at St Padans, because we're saying goodbye to two tutors who've been with us since the very beginning of St Padans. So we're saying goodbye to Susan Blagden, who we said goodbye to this morning at the level 4 midterm seminar. And we're also saying goodbye to Glenn Lend, who's come to say goodbye to you here now. And we thought it was a nice opportunity to be able to say goodbye to Glenn with all of you, because, you know, obviously the work with you and the people training for ministry as well is very much at the heart of what we're about at St Padans. So I just want to thank Glenn so much for all that he's given us on this course on Theology for Life. And I want to thank him particularly for all the help that he's given us with these seminar days, especially when we had to move them online very quickly. Glenn was instrumental really in helping us know how to run Zoom seminar days and this kind of thing. But I just want to thank him for his care and concern for the students and for the candidates as well, and to wish him very well on his ongoing journey. So I don't know if Glenn wants to say anything as he says goodbye to you, but I think he's here. I did see him somewhere. Are you there, Glenn? He was here. I did see him. Just check to see.
Down the pub.
Probably. Glenn, you are here, aren't you? I can see you on the list.
He's muted.
Oh, Glenn, you're muted. We can't hear you, Glenn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, I was telling me I was unmuted. So you were just talking about my technological skill, and I was I supposedly unmuted, and I wasn't speaking. I just wanted to thank everyone, my colleagues, and you, the students. Without you, I wouldn't have been able to share this 5 years of really rewarding work I've been doing with St. Padans. I wish you the very best on your theological studies, and also the transformation that it will give you in your life. I look forward to following your futures and to hear what comes of it. Yes, I just wish to encourage you, if you're finding it difficult or hard, just persevere, because theology is a really rewarding study. Thank you, Manon, for that gracious farewell. Yes, I'll still be, you can still contact me after I've left post and continue the connection. And it's just been a real pleasure to me to teach some of you and to support you on this process. So thank you, everyone, and farewell.
So I'm not sure if they say this in Australia or in England, but in Wales we say, don't be a stranger, paid up than the earth. So don't be a stranger, Glenn. Do keep in touch, and we wish you very, very, very well and every blessing in your continuing ministry. So shall we unmute ourselves and give Glenn a round of applause? So thank you ever so much, Glenn, and thank you for popping in today as well to give us all the opportunity of saying farewell to you.
My pleasure, everyone. Enjoy your seminar, and I look forward to seeing you another time.
Yeah. Bye for now.
In Australian, good on you, mate.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, I'm not sure what's happened there. Jan, you're sharing your screen, I think. There we are. So I'm just going to hand over to Paula now. Sorry, Paula, about that. So thank you so much for coming to do this midterm seminar, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Okay, well, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. I asked Manon what we did at midterm seminars, what you would be expecting, and the answer I got, I think I would call open-ended. So she said basically, you know, whatever you like. I'm sure they'd like a bit of this, a bit of that. So I'm going to give you a bit of this and a bit of that today. And I'm hoping very much that you will contribute, because I often think that the most useful thing that you can do partway through a module like this is have the opportunity to ask questions and to talk a bit about, you know, what you're finding interesting or what you're finding hard to understand or whatever. So what I plan to do today is to start off by looking at assessments, because I think, you know, for me, that has always been the sort of the crunch bit of this midterm seminar when I've done it in the past. And then an opportunity for you to ask questions or make comments about the assessments in particular. And then a little bit about study skills. I want to concentrate today particularly on making an argument, because I think a lot of the questions that I get are what's really meant by an argument in an essay. Then, well, at some point we'll have a break, and that may turn out to be quite a good place for the break, or perhaps just before the study skills, but we'll see how the time goes. And then a bigger question and answer session, I think, about study skills or about the module at large, really. Anything that you have been feeling, I wish I understood that, or I think this is very strange, or whatever. Then there is some teaching, and the teaching that I've attached to this session is something which is sort of a bit of additional extra. It's not really part of the curriculum exactly, and the lecture for it has been up on Moodle, and you may or may not have accessed it already, but it's about Wales and the Welsh Church's relationship with its Celtic past. So, and how we reinterpret our own history, not only reinterpret our religion to suit our context, but also reinterpret our own history and how our Celtic history has been reinterpreted over and over again. And I'm going to do that last, because of the time issue, because it's potentially quite a long lecture, and the lecture which is up on Moodle is quite long, so I can abbreviate it if necessary, depending on how long the rest of it's taken. I don't know that I can stretch it out endlessly if we've been very quick for the rest, but yeah, I'm sure you won't mind leaving early if we finish early. Okay, so I hope I can share my screen and we'll get started on the assessments. Right. Can you now see my PowerPoint that says assessment on it?
Yeah, yes,
can.
Yes.
Good. So the first thing to do when you're thinking about assessment is to be aware, particularly of the learning outcomes of the module. Because assessment is only about you demonstrating to the marker that you have learned from this module what you should have learned from this module. And that's what the learning outcomes are. So they will be looking in your work to see whether you are able to, on the one hand, account historically for some of the principal features of 21st century Welsh church life, particularly within Anglicanism. And on the other hand, they'll be looking to see whether you are able to apply your knowledge of the Welsh Christian tradition to reimagining your own church context and mission. So we come back to what I was talking about in the first session, the introductory session, about this, the connections between the past, the present, and the future. How understanding our past has made us who we are today, and how understanding the pathway that we're on from the past to the future can help us to imagine a future which is different from today and works for the context that we are in and that our own context is developing into. So although that sounds complicated, I hope that the sessions that you've been to, the lectures that you've looked at, the books that you've been reading, all help you to get that flow of ideas into your head and to be able to respond to the information that you're getting in the module in that way, by thinking about how the past has formed us and how we can use what we know of the past to break out of where we are today and to do things differently. So learning outcomes first. So the two questions which are there on Moodle and obviously in the handbook, so I hope that you've had a look at them and have got some idea about them already. So the first is an essay, and in a way we all know what an essay is. It is a way of writing down our ideas about a particular subject, about a particular question that we're asked. And it is worth bearing in mind that that is what you're writing about. So we look at this essay, you've got 3,000 words for it, so it's most of your assessment. And it wants you to identify two significant developments in the history of Welsh Christianity from two different centuries, which have helped to shape church life today. And for each, discuss why they developed in the context of their own period. So what was going on which caused those developments, and whether the impact on the churches is still relevant in today's context. So I hope that that's what how you've been approaching the material, and that it should come relatively easily to you to look at your chosen developments in that sort of way. Now, I've been teaching this also to full-time students, and one thing that they asked at this stage was about the two different centuries. So when you teach a history module, or when you're learning a history module chronologically, that is, say, you start at the beginning and you keep going until you get up to today and then you stop. It's relatively easy to identify a chronology in that, to identify what's going on in the 16th century or the 18th century or the 20th century. But this module is arranged rather differently. This module is arranged thematically. So we've been looking at models of church across several centuries. We've been looking at models of ministry, models of laity across several centuries. And so they rightly said to me that it's actually quite difficult to say this what I want to write about belongs to a particular century. And they are absolutely right that you can't pinpoint change. It grows over quite a long period, and then it moves on over a longer period and changes again. But you will find that when history is written, people tend to latch onto a particular event or a particular set of events, which is set in a relatively narrow timescale, and see that as the key events or the key people to do with that. So let's take an example of that. If we think about the Oxford movement was the beginning of what led to a strong Catholic revival. The Oxford movement itself was an intellectual movement of the early 19th century, which developed in the later 19th century into ritualism and Anglo-Catholicism in the parishes. But the Oxford movement itself came from a period of time in which ideas about church and state were changing. And although we've largely forgotten it today, the Oxford movement was, to a large extent, an anti-establishment movement. It was beginning to feel, as the world was changing around them, some scholars were beginning to feel that it wasn't good for the church to be so closely linked to the state. So in a way, the developments of the 18th century, in which the church and the state began to separate, were part of that development of the Catholic revival. And in some ways, ritualism of the late 19th century is the most important part of that. But you will often have that feeling that the Oxford movement in the early part of the 19th century is the key event of that. So depending on what you want to write about, you might place that in the early 19th century with the Oxford movement. You might place it in the late 18th century with the beginnings of developments of change in the relationship between church and state, or you might want to put it into the later 19th century when it was a parochial movement, which had a very different set of effects, and possibly which could be seen as having affected Wales, not more than England, but more perhaps than the Oxford movement itself. So depending on what you want to write on, you can place that in different centuries or different parts of centuries. I wouldn't worry too much about the precise dating of what you want to write about. But what you do want to do is make sure that you are writing about two really different sets of events and developments, so that you get the chance to have a broader approach to the essay. Basically, if you write about two things which are very similar, the examiner will not be able to see that you've got a broad understanding of wider areas in the module. Okay. You need to be able to say what it was that was going on in that period, which caused that to happen. And I think in the case of the Oxford movement, as I say, you would talk about some of those changes in the relationship with church and state, with some of the 18th and early 19th century political changes which were affecting dissent, and quite a lot of other things, and which meant that the attempt to change the church and make it more independent of the state, and at the same time bring in a different sort of theology, were relevant to that period. And then you're also asked to think about the church in Wales today in its own context, and think about whether those changes are as relevant now as they were then. So if we then think about the effect of the Oxford movement and the Catholic revival within the church in Wales, you can think about the advantages of having had that Catholic revival, which might be to do with theology or tradition, might be to do with the spiritual changes, a sort of ideas in terms of spirituality and sacramentalism and so on, which have given many good things to the church. You might also want to think whether actually in the context of an age which is much more secular, in which it's really rather unhelpful for there to be divisions along tradition lines within the church, and unhelpful for there to be divisions between the churches, which are based on those 19th century developments, then that might help you to think about how much of that you would want to hang on to, and how much of that you might want to dispense with when you're trying to imagine a future for the church in Wales. So I hope that broadens it out a bit for the essay question. Then question 2 is a reflection, and this is very short. 1,000 words is not much for you to write about. And this is a standard question. My understanding is that this is basically the second question that you get for all your modules, and you just relate it to what you've learned in this particular module. So should be used to this. But you need to be able to demonstrate an understanding of one particular aspect of this module, which is relevant to a life of discipleship and ministry. So that's very personal to you. And as I'm sure you know, a reflection is different from an essay in that it is very much about you and your response to the module and what you have learned from it and how it may have changed your ideas. So you are again expected to show some understanding of a particular aspect of this module, and one that you will have chosen because it perhaps has had some effect on you, has changed your ideas, have given you some ideas for how your own life of discipleship might develop. And then demonstrate the ability to relate this aspect of the module to that context, that is to say, to your own context, your own life of discipleship and ministry. And that will be a personal approach to the module. And I hope that the ideas in the module will have made you think about your own personal development and your own personal life, and how your Christian faith and your church practices might be different because of some of the things that you've learned in this module. Now, the next thing I want to do is just very rapidly, and I know this is quite heavy, but it really is worth looking at. You will find both on Moodle and in the module handbook. Now, it's not a module handbook, is it? It's a module guide these days, no handbooks. In the module guide, you will find a lot of stuff about these criteria. But it's quite important that you know what the examiners are looking for so that you can be sure you get it into your assessment. Actually, assessment is a very mechanistic process in some ways. You just make sure you know what you're supposed to have learned, and you make sure you show that you've learned it in your essays. But there are criteria that markers use, which are set by the university. And there's a lot more about it in module, which give you the general things that people are looking for under these criteria. But what I want to take you through now is the particular things that the marker for this module will be looking out for under those criteria. So the first criterion is engagement with literature skills, and that means what you've read, how thoughtfully you've read it, whether you've questioned it, how you've applied it to your learning, how you've used it as evidence for what you're writing. And the particular advice that I give on this is that when you refer to sources that you've read, you need to look both for how they've affected changes in church life, but also for the wider context to which the churches were responding. So when you're reading and when you're using your reading in the essay question, make sure that you're demonstrating that what you have read has not just been about what's going on in the church, but also about the wider context, because this module is very much about how the church and the wider context within which the church exists have interacted over the past. Less so now, but hopefully more so in the future. So the context is important. And in the reflective piece, because it's a short reflective piece, the weighting for this criterion is lower. That means to say that although you are expected to have engaged with literature skills, you're not going to be spending a lot of time in the reflective piece telling us what this writer has said about it or what that writer has said about it. But what you will want to do is to show when you're talking about how you yourself have responded to it, possibly say that you found what this particular writer said really interesting because, so it influenced your thinking. Yes, I think that's how, and obviously, when you do mention a writer's work, unless it's a very general thing that writer talks about, then you should be referencing it in the proper way. So, when you say this writer has written about X, which has influenced me, you need to say which book, you need to say what date, you need to say, if possible, what pages, or at least chapter 7, so give a general idea of where the examiner can find those references. So that's engagement with literature skills. Then the next criterion is knowledge and understanding. And for component 1, for the essay, my advice is that you need to show you have a good knowledge and understanding of the church's past and of the elements of modern church life which have been influenced by the developments you've chosen. So when you're talking about the past, don't just say, this is what happened in the past and it was very influential. You need to be able to say these aspects of modern church life are rooted in those events in the past and that context. So keep it specific if you can, and sometimes that will be easier than others. For example, at the Reformation, the church was set up to be a very broad church so that it could include everybody within the country. And that has so hugely influenced the church in Wales and the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and indeed, to a much lesser extent, other parts of Anglicanism, that in a way it's very difficult to be specific about it. But for example, you might want to be talking about whether that very, very broad approach to theology, which was changed in the 19th century by the Catholic revival and the evangelical revival, whether that very, very broad approach is something that we perhaps need to try and go back to, or whether actually we perhaps should abandon the attempt to be universal in an age where there are so many denominations. Perhaps that's no longer an essential role of the Church in Wales. But you will need to be able to say that broadness which we value, possibly too much, who knows, comes from the fact that the Church was founded at the Reformation not on the basis of the teachings of a particular theologian, as Calvinist churches are or Lutheran churches are, but on the attempt to find a form of Christianity and worship which would allow such a very broad range of views to coexist within it. And under knowledge and understanding in the reflection, as you apply what you've learned to how it might affect your own discipleship and ministry, you need to be able to show in that you have understood and thought about different models of whatever element of church life it is that you're wanting to write about. So we've been introduced to quite a lot of different models of ways of doing under different themes, and when you're writing your reflection, you need to be able to show that it is rooted in, you have understood the difference between some of those models, and that they have helped to form your imaginative look at what your discipleship and ministry and church life and so on might be in the future. So the third criterion is cognitive and intellectual skills. And for component one, this is a lot of these cognitive and intellectual skills are about the ability to analyze, to see what is connected with what, and to divide up, if you like, to sort your ideas and to sort what you've learned into different headings, and to see connections between the different areas that you have analysed. So for your essay, you need to be able to show that you can make connections between the context within which events happened and the effect they had on the church. So if you say, okay, the church became more Catholic in the 19th century, you need to be able to show that part of the reason for that was because of this reaction against the relationship with the state and a desire to move further away and to return to the church's past, to return to a point at which the church was, if you like, more of a church triumphant. And at the same time, it was also a response to the Romantic movement, and we'll be talking about that later. I don't imagine you've got to that stage yet, but it was also a reaction to the Romantic movement, which coloured really everything that happened in that early 19th century period when people were looking back to the Middle Ages and, you know, holding tournaments. And this is where Eisteddfodau were sort of reinvented and so on. So it's all part of that Romantic movement. And you need to be able to show that you can make some of those connections. Don't be too daunted by all that. It doesn't have to be hugely comprehensive, but you just do need to make clear that you are aware of those connections. And also, because you're looking forward, you need to be able to think about and to show that you've thought about what is temporary, what is provisional, in the church's development and what is caused by particular elements in the context of a time, and what is essential to Christianity, which of the elements of church life today are the absolute core of Christian faith and Christian church life, and which are accretions, if you like, which have come into the church because of particular situations, particular contexts in the past. And in the reflection, you need to be able to show that you've shown in question 1 that you've done the analysis, you've sorted the ideas, you're able to make the connections. And in your reflection, you need to be able to show that your imaginings of the future are firmly rooted in the learning that you've had from the module. And I've said they're built on a plausible analysis of societal trends, by which I mean that if you're looking at the future of the church, you need also to be looking at the future of society, the future of society, with the society within which we're living. And in order to do that, you need to be able to see, if you like, that the church is on a particular place, moving from somewhere towards that future. And so be aware of the direction of traffic, if you like, the direction of flow. Now, we'll be talking more about that in the last unit of the module, when we are very specifically looking at what might all this look like in the future. And the lecture for that module has not actually gone up yet, but will be going up by the time you get there. So that will perhaps not quite sound quite so complex and difficult by the time you've had that lecture. I hope so, anyway. Practical skills. For the essay, this is just about being able to write clearly, being able to lay out an argument supported by evidence. You need to be able to show that you can apply your understanding of the various models you've studied to critique inherited models. So when I say critique inherited models, I'm saying we in the church today have inherited models which have been formed in the past. And so in the essay, you need to be able to show that you can think critically. Critique means think critically about those inherited models and say, yeah, perhaps they're not relevant to today. Or, yeah, look, actually, we really need to hang on to these. These are still relevant for the following reasons. And in the reflection, this is about the ability to apply what you've learned. And so for the reflection, being able to apply what you've learned is actually the most important thing that you're demonstrating in the reflection, because it is about saying, yep, I've looked at the past, I've considered how it's affected the future, and this is how I'm able to apply it to my own life, my own discipleship, my own future. So this practical ability to apply what you've learned is given a big weighting. We'll come on to weightings in a minute for the second, for the reflective one. Transferable skills for life and professional practice. This is a criterion which, in a way, is very helpful, but it is designed, I think, for university students who are young and who are at university with a view to going into the world of work. So they're not perhaps as important to some of us that are learning now as it is to sort of younger students who are embarking on life. Nevertheless, in terms of transferable skills, you need to be able to demonstrate clarity of expression, coherence, and a good grasp of structure, and what academic writing requires of you. So this is really just about writing a good essay, being able to write clearly so that people can understand what you're saying, and also, you know, having an understanding of how academic writing works and how it's different from other sorts of writing. So, you know, needing to reference authors that you've read and so on and so forth. It's probably not the most important criterion, but nevertheless, you will get better marks if you show that you can write clearly and if you get your referencing right and all those things. But the weighting for it is not so strong. And so just a quick look at the weighting. So for the essay, the highest weighting is for the knowledge and understanding and for the cognitive and intellectual skills. So the essay is basically about the sort of classic, what you have learned factually from it and how you have been able to analyze and arrange those ideas in your mind and approach them critically. So those are 25% of the marks for those two each. So half the marks you can get by getting those right. Engagement with literature skills and practical skills. So showing that you have read and understood what other people have written about this subject, and those practical skills of being able to apply what you've learned and so on, 20% each. And then just 10% for the good writing, clarity, and the ability to reference correctly and just, you know, show that you've understood the conventions of academic writing. Whereas with component 2, with the reflection, very little, only 10% for the engagement with literature skills. So if you are able to show that you've been influenced by what you've read, you will get some marks for that, but it's less important. Similarly, for knowledge and understanding and cognitive and intellectual skills, they are still important, but in relation to the ability to apply it, they are less important. The practical skills, that ability to apply what you've learned and reflect and come up with some interesting and innovative ideas about how you might be influenced in your life of discipleship by what you've learned in this module, is the most important part here. And again, 10% for those writing ability and academic ability and so on. So that is assessment. And now really it's questions. I don't know whether anything's been coming through on chat because I haven't been watching the chat. But does anybody have any questions at this stage?
There's been nothing coming up on the chat at all.
It's incomprehensible. All that I've said doesn't even inspire questions. Anybody want to come up with any questions at this stage? Any further explanation? I know this is terribly dry, but it is important.
I can see John with his hand up, his physical hand.
Physical hand, wow.
Yeah, I'm very well behaved. May I speak? I've the transferable skills that you've just mentioned, Paula. Could you explain and help me understand why they are just 10% when I'm thinking they're more associated with discipleship, with life and practice, and what you actually do? Why are they therefore marked so with a 10% value? Is that my understanding, or can you explain that a little bit more to me?
Yes, I think it depends how you define transferable skills. I wonder whether you'd like to say a bit about what you feel transferable skills, when you say these are really important for discipleship and so on. What I've been thinking of are things like, you know, being able to write clearly and, you know, to express yourself well and so on in writing, which, you know, I think are probably less important, but it may well be that you have a different view. So could you just expand a bit on what you mean by, what you understand by that?
What I'm thinking is, it says life and practice, and what I'm thinking is because we all need to change, and I found personally that each one of these modules has made me change the way I look at things, much broader and deeper, and examine things that I never looked at before. But it all kind of culminates in making a difference in me, to make me different. And I'm looking at the transferable skills, and it goes on to say life and practice. And that's where I'm making the link between life and practice. In other words, don't learn it for learning's sake. Do something with it. That's my question.
You're absolutely right. That is what this module is about. It's I suppose the difference is that when I think about those things, I don't think of them as transferable skills in the sense of the criterion that is being applied to the essays. I would be looking to find those things in what I've defined as, and I've defined it in relation to how the university describes what it means by those criteria in the practical skills, which is about, you know, being able to take what you've learned and apply it. So I think we're absolutely agreed on what's important. But when I read your essays, I will be reading them in terms of that 40% for practical skills rather than the 10% for transferable skills. Thanks for the question. That's really useful.
We've got a question on chat, first of all, from Sharon. What are the key events you might expect to be discussed in the essay?
Well, I mean, almost anything that we've talked about in the module, to be honest. I mean, let's think about oh, hang on, I've now got masses and masses of chat. Let's think about the disestablishment, and I'm using that one simply because when I'm going to talk about essay writing, that's the subject that I've centered it on. So disestablishment is a key event. It is in making the Church in Wales the way it is. If you were writing about that, you would want to bring in much of what was going on in the 19th century, which led up at the end of the day to disestablishment. and so you could produce an essay which set disestablishment very, very clearly in its own context, and at the same time looked at the effect it had had on the church in Wales today, which has first of all made it absolutely distinguished from the Church of England, from which it was separated at disestablishment. But you also might want to think, if that fact of disestablishment was brought about by the context of the later 19th century and the divisions, the political difficulties that were going on then, should we be rethinking what a disestablished church looks like? Because whenever a significant change like that happens, you'll find that the first thing that happens is that it tries to stay as much the same as it was before as possible. And so the Church in Wales disestablished, apart from its relationship with the state and the fact that it was also disendowed at the same time, so it was much poorer, is in many ways very, very like what it was when it was established. And perhaps in a very different world, we might want to rethink what a church in Wales that's not established actually looks like. So that's one sort of key event. Or you could talk about, the Reformation, which obviously is significant. We've talked about that. Something like the evangelical revival of the 18th century. Think about how that has affected the way that the church in Wales is. I think if you go back to any of the units, you'll find that within those units there are models, we talk about models, which are set within a set of events. It doesn't have to be a moment in time, like disestablishment. It could be, something much more like the evangelical revival, which actually took place in a period of about 30 years in the early 18th century, and then led to a different evangelical revival at the end of the 18th century. They can be fairly broad events, or they can be relatively narrow events. But I think if you just think in terms of, okay, what in that unit particularly struck me as having created change in the church in Wales, that's, you will find an event there, but you can interpret event fairly widely.
Steve has his hand up. Steve Rollins.
Hi, Paula. I had thought before today's session that I might look at the Reformation period, the Welsh Bible, and as curate for Pennell, I thought I might look at Glendower's Pennell Letters and the vision for the Welsh Church, which it sets out, and compare it with what happened at disestablishment and now and for the future. But are these, these are both very specific. Are they too specific for this kind of essay?
They needn't be. I think provided that you are, it's not a compare and contrast question. No. So you need to avoid getting caught up in that. Mm-hmm. You do need to be treating those subjects, in the way that the question lays down. It's understandably very easy to take a subject that you're particularly interested in and make lots of interesting connections and write about that. I think it's not the specificness of them, that need be a problem, though. You just need to make sure that when you're writing about them, you're writing about them in the way that the question has asked for. Because if you get away from that, that's when you begin to, the examiner begins to think, hang on, why are you telling me this? That's not what I wanted to know, you know. Does that help?
I guess so. It's scary, that's all.
Tell me about scary. Why is it scary?
I guess I'm just struggling all the way through, well, with these things. I feel I'm doing fine in terms of the group work, but written work seems to just doesn't seem to be going the way I would like.
Right. I mean, if you want to send me an essay plan, this goes for everybody. You know, you are welcome. No more than one side of A4, I think it says.
Yeah.
And I'd be very grateful because there are a lot of you, and even one side of A4 takes time to critique. But do, because I absolutely understand that getting these things down in writing, particularly when you're not used to it, is really not easy. So do feel free to just put your ideas down briefly, send it along to me, make it a plan so I can get a sense of how the essay will progress. And I'm very happy to talk that through with you, give you my comments. But don't get too worried about it is really important, I think. It's better to write the best you can than to get terribly worried about trying to produce something which is unnatural and you don't really understand what you're aiming at, and you feel it's a bit beyond you. Write what you want to write, but just keep bearing in mind what the question is asking you. Anybody else?
Catherine has a question.
Hi, yeah. Thanks, Paula. It was more connecting the essay 2 with essay 1 when we're having to reflect on what we've discussed in essay 1, because they're going to be submitted as different. They're not submitted together, are they? They're going to be different submissions. So how do we then sort of make that connection? Do we have to put in what we've written in essay 1? I'm not really explaining it very well, but it is how do we connect those two? Or is essay 2 a completely separate assignment? If we're talking about a particular development and how it's affected us, then we're going to have to sort of do a bit of background of that assessment in our reflection so that we connect the dots, if you see what I mean.
That's a really important question, and thank you very much for it. And actually, it was also asked in this session by one of the full-time students, so I'm glad you've asked it. You do not have to use the same points that the same areas that you've discussed in question 1, in question 2. They're two separate things. You can so you've got question 1, which allows you to talk about 2 areas. If you want to use one, you can, but you know, it might even be better to use a different one to show that you know that there's more than 2. But you do not need to go into a lot of detail. The examiner is not using this question to find out what you know about all that. So you take something which has been of interest to you, and you know the line is sort of, you know, I was particularly interested in what I had learned about X. It made me think about, well, I think it would be worth saying, you know, the fact that this happened and that happened made me think about Y. And you know, it's made me feel that, you know, my ministry might go, my devotional life, my discipleship might go in this direction for the following reasons. But you this is not where the examiner is looking for you to show what you know about this area, but only to show that you know enough about this area to have influenced your views. And by talking about how it's influenced you, you will be bringing out what you know about that area. Okay, so you don't have to worry too much about laying out a lot of factual stuff about whatever it is that you've chosen to reflect on. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can we go to one of the chat questions first? So from Maya Wen, much of the reading for the module has not been Welsh specific. Could you suggest additional online reading material or sources, please?
Not at this stage, I can't. I'm afraid I don't have in my head, but I will have a look and see what I can find. However, I think it's sometimes hard to remember that what has been the history of the Church of England is the history of the Church in Wales. So that an awful lot of what I talk about in this module are developments which have affected Wales and England together. So in a way, they are Welsh specific. I mean, we don't actually start, well, I was about to say, we don't actually start developing differently from the Church of England until the 20th century, but of course it's not true then either. Even after we've been disestablished, even after we're separate in legal terms and in lots of other terms from the Church of England, the fact is that the same things affect us. So coronavirus is not having very different effects in Wales from what it's having in England on society. I think it's a mistake to. Well, it's not a mistake. It's natural, but it's probably not helpful to you to try and be looking for things which only happened in Wales or which only affected Wales as things which have influenced the Church in Wales today, because there are very, very, very few things that have only happened in Wales that have affected the Church in Wales today. In some cases, you'll find that the Church in Wales may have responded differently, but that's quite rare. And what I've tried to do is to talk about developments that have affected all of us, and then where I can, to look at particular examples that are Welsh examples, but which are demonstrating things that also affect the Church of England as well. So I wouldn't worry too much about looking for very specifically Welsh examples, but I will look and see if I can find any online resources which are particularly Welsh for you to look at.
It might be worth for me to say as well that the Church in Wales are running a series of lectures online. They'll be in Welsh, but they'll have translations in English. And these are on very key Anglican figures from the Church in Wales over the years. So it's not part of this course, but you might be interested, to see your own learning.
I'm interested in looking at the Bible translation and through the ages. Are you saying that that's not a good source for the first essay?
A Bible translation through the ages.
Well, I'm looking thinking specifically about William Morgan, and then about how the Mary Jones story relates to bringing the Bible to the common man in Wales.
Okay, well, let's think about that in terms of the question. So the question is, if I can get back to it.
Just to say as well, we've got two other people with hands up and another question
Okay.
on chat.
Right, I will try and be a bit quicker. So 2 developments from the history of Welsh Christianity which have helped to shape church life today. So if we're thinking about the translation of the Welsh Bible and how that has affected Welsh life today, you might want to bring in Mary Jones as an example of the sort of cultural significance of the Welsh Bible, but it perhaps doesn't lead us very directly to the significance of the translation of the Welsh Bible for Welsh today. I think you need to be thinking about how many words you've got and how much the Mary Jones issue helps to develop your argument, if you like. Okay, more questions.
So Sonia had a hand up.
Hi everyone. Mine is more or less a technically sort of question. In talking about 2 separate centuries, how restricted are we to, say we're talking of the 1st century, actually, you know, within that century, can we span half of one century and another century? Or must it relate specifically, say, to the 1st or the 18th centuries?
Yeah, I wouldn't be wanting to write too much about the 1st century, I think, in this module.
Oh, but just an example.
But yes, I mean, you might want to go back to the Celtic period, perhaps, if you were sure that the Celtic period had a big influence on the church in Wales today. You don't worry too much about being very specific about timing. It is true that almost all developments cover long periods of time, and it's quite artificial to divide them up into centuries, because unless something happened right in the middle of a century, it almost certainly will have spread over.
So we're not going to be marked down if we move outside the specific century that we're talking about.
Yes, I shouldn't worry about being marked down. It's basically about being marked up. That's what the examiner is looking for, the opportunity to give you marks, not to take them away from you. But you're absolutely right. Provided that it's clear in what you write, that you understand the chronology, you understand, you know, what comes first, second, and third, and approximately how many decades they're likely to cover, you'll get good marks for that.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier about it's not a compare and a contrast between the two eras that we chose, but are we expected in maybe a conclusion to give an analysis or a summary of how they might link together, or are they completely 2 separate components within the essay?
I think you'll find that just depends on what you've chosen. I mean, what I'm hoping simply is that you will choose 2 areas which allow you to write about very different things, so that you can show across a broader range that what you've learned from the module, that's what it's for. But you may find that actually, although they're different, there are some relationships between them, and if you think there are, then yes, absolutely, bring them out. That that might well be a very interesting application of what you've learned. But as I keep saying, go back to the question, make sure that you're answering the question, that rather than being taken along a really interesting route, which you've been led to as you think about the things that you're writing about.
And then finally, you mentioned that right at the beginning about equipping students to understand the Welsh Christian tradition, particularly the Reformation. You're not looking to tie us specifically into writing about the Reformation.
No, I'm slightly thrown because I don't remember having said particularly the Reformation. I probably did.
Yeah. And we had a brief chat about this in our group last week.
Yeah.
And some, you know, there seemed to be an inference that the Reformation, perhaps in that sentence, was something that was what was being looked for particularly.
Okay, well, I mean, the Reformation is clearly hugely important to Anglicanism in that it didn't exist before the Reformation. It is the product of the Reformation. And so, you know, it's quite difficult to think about Anglicanism generally without being aware of its origins in the Reformation. But no, you do not have to write about the Reformation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Aaron's got a question as well.
Thank you, Manon. Hi, Paula.
Hi.
Just one short question. So, in regard to assignment 2, right? I'm going to be talking about demonstrating an understanding of one particular aspect of this model, right? Now, my view, like on an aspect, and correct me if I'm wrong, that could be of anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be something historical. It could be, say, one of the smaller articles. It could be some of the work by, say, Stephen Cottrell, spoiling the broth, too many cooks spoil the broth, or something, the ministry of the whole church, or something like that. Is it okay to write that you've actually read that article and that's sort of given you inspiration for future discipleship ministry? Would that be okay?
In a way, I would say yes, but it depends, because
Right.
you come back to the learning outcomes.
Right, okay.
So the learning outcomes of this module are, what you are trying to demonstrate is that you can account historically for some of the preachers, and that you can apply your knowledge of the Welsh Christian tradition to reimagining your own church context and mission. So you might well want to talk about the way that the role of laity has been changed over the sort of 19th and 20th century, and that needs to be done differently, if you like. And you might well be saying that a particular author, a particular thing that you've read, has influenced your views on that. But try not to confine yourself to just what that particular author has said, because it will be taking you away from, it will make it more difficult for you to demonstrate that you've met the learning outcomes if you don't set it into the context of the historical reasons why the laity are no longer as important in church life as they were in, say, the 18th century. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we've got a question on chat from Andy. I am interested in writing about the establishment of Methodism and the position of the Methodist Church in Wales today. It's not a subject we have really covered in the unit. How does that sound for one of the topics?
It doesn't, you don't have to write about Anglicanism. So if you want to, if you're particularly knowledgeable about Methodism and about what the Methodist Church is like in Wales today, but do bear in mind that we're not necessarily talking about the same Methodism, in that Welsh Calvinistic Methodism is different from Wesleyan Methodism. So if you're going to write about Methodism in the church in Wales today, in Wales today, then you need at least to make it clear that you know the difference between 18th century Calvinistic Methodism and modern Methodism, which is, you know, could well also be Calvinistic Methodism. I don't know where you're coming from, but Wesleyan Methodism is much stronger in Wales than it was then, but it came in largely during the sort of urbanization, development of, you know, mining and so on in the south. But so yes, you could write about that, but make sure that you're going back to the learning outcomes and you're answering the question.
So as far as I can tell, they're all the questions. I can't see any other hands there.
Okay, well, that has taken us through to 3 o'clock, which is quite good going, actually. It's taken longer than I expected, but I hope it's been helpful. I think that the chance to ask questions once you get going is really important. I think that's a good moment for a pause. I don't know. So just a little bit about study skills. And I thought the first thing I'd do is, again, share my screen, just to show you where there are lots of really, really good, I think this is the one, really good resources for study skills. And you may know all about these already, but I know we don't always explore Moodle as much as we might. So I just want to go on to Moodle, and if you go into My Courses, you will find information for students. And that has, again, some stuff which is really quite dull, like, you know, reflective writing and video, that's very useful stuff, but Guide to the Harvard Referencing System, all this, you know, clearly enticing. But if you either at the side here or by scrolling down endlessly, go to study skills. That's not going to let me do that, I don't think. What a pity. I will have to scroll down endlessly. Keep going. Moodle settings or St. Padon's email account. I think we should move it further up, as a matter of fact, because it's really crucial, this study skills stuff. There you will find lots and lots of really good videos and bits and pieces on study skills. Absolutely terrific. So do go into there and read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest all this stuff, because your assessment will be greatly improved if you do learn more about study skills, and they're really, really helpful, some of these. So that's the first thing, and I'm not going to try and say that what I'm going to do now is more useful than any of those, but it is just something that I have put together because I think I hope that it could be helpful. And I'll stop sharing that screen and start sharing another screen instead. Because what I want particularly to talk about is, can I find it? Constructing an essay, that looks like one. Is about creating an argument within your essay. Okay, and we all see that. So that is the question. Why was the Welsh Church disestablished? A sample question, not a question to do with this module, but a question to do with history and something I know about. And what I want to suggest to you is that when you're writing an essay, you can actually create a plan which has a strong argument running through it by sitting down first and just thinking about, what do I want to say in this essay? Don't worry at this stage about the order of things, but just ideas that you think will be relevant when you come to write this essay. Not too many of them. You have to be fairly disciplined about it, because actually there are often lots of things that might be useful. And just write them down as they come into your head. So that was actually what I did when I was producing this slide. I asked myself the question, why was the Welsh Church disestablished? And obviously it's something I already know reasonable amount about. But you will be in the position that you have done the reading for your essay, or some reading for your essay, and you will have decided to write it because it's something that you're interested in and know a bit about. So I wrote down, just as they came into my head. Okay, and it's important to write these in the form of a sentence. Do not, this is not the only way of approaching it. Let me say, it is a way of approaching it, but it works for me. So for this way of approaching it, do not write down, I want to write about something. So don't write, I want to write about 1920, or just, you know, what happened in 1920. The Welsh Church was disestablished in 1920. Nice sentence. And the reason I'm saying write a sentence is because when you've got all these sentences in the right order, they will be the first sentences of each paragraph. So other ideas then for this essay, I thought, well, it's all about nonconformist campaigning and the Liberal Party. So the Liberal Party brought nonconformist campaigners and radical politicians together. And it was because of that coming together at the end of the day that the Welsh Church was disestablished. And then Lloyd George was really important. So Lloyd George was a Welsh nonconformist. And that's one of the things that led up to the disestablishment of the Welsh Church. But actually there was something much bigger going on. So I want to write about the whole political movement that between nonconformists and people who are looking for political reform, which actually brought about the Liberal Party. So in the 19th century, there was a vigorous political movement from nonconformists to remove the privileges of the Church of England. And that's clearly really important if you want to write about disestablishment. And then you need to make it clear that before disestablishment, the Welsh dioceses were part of the Church of England. So that'll be an important thing to say in your essay. But of course, the Welsh Church was disestablished, but the English Church wasn't. And part of the reason for that was because in 1851, a religious census had shown that 75% of worshippers in Wales were nonconformists. So it clearly didn't actually make much sense for the Church of England to be the established church in Wales. And then actually, perhaps I should say something about what disestablishment means. So I've got a sentence, disestablishment means that the church is no longer established in law and ruled by the state. And then I'm running out of space on the slide, and this is probably quite enough points to make in an essay. But it is important to point out that until the 19th century, there were penalties for dissenters. And that was why the dissenters were very keen to make things change, and why they hated the Church of England, because the Church of England had been privileged all those years when the nonconformists had all these penalties that stopped them from doing lots of things. So there you are, you've got your essay, and you've got, you know, 7 or 8 points that you want to make, or things that you think you need to talk about. And then the next stage, and this is the really important stage in constructing an argument, is getting them in the right order. So you might, if you looked at all these, want to come up with a different order, and that would be fine too, provided that it produced an argument, that it led, when I say produce an argument, I mean you are leading the reader, you are leading the marker in a logical way from the point at which you start through building up all the things that you want to establish, so that by the time you come to the end of your essay, you have established clearly the argument that has made you reach the conclusion that you have about why the Welsh Church was established. So for me, I think probably I need to put, oh, now that's going to be tricky, isn't it? I need to go back. I may not be able to do this very well. I think that in order to do this, I need to move out of slideshow mode and show. Okay, so I want to go back to this in a way which I can start moving things around, because I want to rearrange these now. So let's start by just, as you would in a good essay, you want to start by engaging with the question. So you first establish that you know what the question means, that you understand the question, and give some idea of how you're going to deal with it. So the first thing to do is to make it clear that you know what disestablishment means. So I would put that up at the top. That's the first thing I want to say. And then probably you need to say something about why dissenters were so keen to disestablish the church, to get rid of the church's privileges. So then I might want to talk about the penalties for dissenters. But then we probably need to get on to what really led up to this establishment. And the big thing that led up to that was the political movement, which actually stretched across much of the 19th century for reform in church and state. And so the next thing that I want to talk about is the political movement for nonconformists to remove the privileges of the Church of England. So I think what we've got there is we know what disestablishment means. We're talking about the fact that there were penalties for dissenters, and then said in the 19th century we began to get developments, and this where nonconformists were trying to change things. And then understand why that political movement and nonconformists, how they came together. So I think the next thing to go in there is the Liberal Party. So the Liberal Party began in the middle of the 19th century, bringing together people who were looking for political reform and nonconformists who wanted religious reform. And when you get to that point in the module, you'll understand better, I think, how it was that those political movement and religious movement came together. But for the disestablishment of the Church in Wales, it was absolutely crucial that they did come together, and that this political movement involved both politicians who were less interested in the religious outcome, and nonconformists who were looking for changes in the relationship between the different denominations. So there you've got a situation where there's a big political movement about it. And then the crucial thing for Wales was the religious census of 1851. So that probably comes next. Here's the Liberal Party, nonconformist campaigners, radical politicians, all campaigning for change. Why Wales? Well, because in 1851, it was shown that unlike the rest of England, Wales had a significant majority of people worshipping in nonconformist churches, which made the Church of England's status in Wales quite difficult. So put that in next. and then we probably need to make it clear that the Welsh diocese had been part of the Church of England. And I think that could either go in here after the 1851 census, or it could go in earlier on. And as you write the essay, you may feel that you want to slightly change the order, that it seems more logical to change the order. You can do that. But for the time being, I'll put it in there. And then I'll point out that Lloyd George, who was probably the most significant person in bringing about Welsh disestablishment, and was obviously a very powerful force in the Liberal Party, was a Welsh nonconformist. And so if I put that in next, then I can talk about why it was that even through into the 20th century, when much of the call for disestablishment, except in Wales, had died away, nevertheless, even at the end of that period, when much of the heat had gone out of it, the Welsh Church was disestablished because Lloyd George was a Welsh nonconformist, had that powerful position in the Liberal Party, and was determined to deliver on his election promises to disestablish the church in Wales. And then you end with the statement that because of all these reasons that you have now explained, the Welsh Church was disestablished in 1920. So by doing it that way, you have created a flow of information which has built up to the answer to the question. And when you get to the end, the Welsh Church was disestablished in 1920. That is your final paragraph. And you can then go back through the argument briefly to demonstrate the reasons why that happened in 1920. And I just very briefly then, having said start by getting together these sentences and then putting them in the right order. And that putting them in the right order is the key to producing the argument. Then just show a little bit about how that would develop. So if you start your introductory paragraph, disestablishment means that the church is no longer established in law, then in that paragraph you can talk about the church being established by law. So talk about the Act of Uniformity, and at the Reformation, we do get back to the Reformation almost however hard we try. The Act of Uniformity and various further acts of uniformity, and about the church being established in law, and then point out that that was the case right through in England and Wales until the 20th century. So you've laid out the position about establishment right at the beginning. And you've shown the examiner that you really read the question, you understand what the question is all about, and you are clear about what the implications of establishment and disestablishment are. And then, because this is your introductory paragraph, you may also want to go on from there and just point out how you intend to write your essay. So this essay will consider what it was about the context of the church in the 19th and early 20th century Britain, which brought about the disestablishment of the church in Wales. So you've looked at the question, you've shown that you've understood the question, and you've looked at the key words and shown that you know what they mean. And now you're telling people how you propose to approach the question. And immediately you're making it clear to the examiner that you know that what led up to the disestablishment of the church in Wales were events that happened in the 19th century. So back, 50 at least, 50, 60 years more probably before the disestablishment of the church in Wales. You have to go back that far to understand why it happened. So that's your first paragraph. And then just by way of demonstration, second paragraph, until the 19th century, there were penalties for dissenters. Then you go on and explain who dissenters are and what the penalties were for being a dissenter. And you show, you talk about how initially it was hoped that everybody would be able to worship together within the Church of England, but that the Civil War in particular and the Puritan Commonwealth meant that once the Church of England was re-established, if you like, the restoration of the monarchy, you show that there has to be some recognition of dissent, because there were congregations that were Puritan congregations who would not rejoin the Church of England. And then you also want to demonstrate to the markers that you've read some books. So you have said, you've got your first sentence of the paragraph, you've expanded on the first sentence of the paragraph to show exactly what it is you want to say about that. And then I'm talking about then what people have written. So Doreen Rosman, and you give a reference for that, describes the Toleration Act as one of the most significant changes in the history of English and Welsh religion, in that it introduced the possibility of legally recognized religious pluralism. Now I give myself a plug. In the early years of toleration, numbers of dissenting congregations were relatively small. Paula Yates tells us that in Wales, dissenters made up only about 6% of the population until the second evangelical revival of the late 18th century. So you've told the examiner what you want to say about it. You've taken them a step further in the argument, and you have shown that you've read the books and that brought them in to support what you're saying. And then at the end of that slide, I've just put in the references as they should appear. And obviously, you then go on. I'm not going to write the entire essay here. But so then you move on to talk about the vigorous political movement from nonconformists, and the next paragraph will follow on from that sentence in the same way as the previous paragraphs have followed on from those sentences. And because you're using those sentences, because you're using them in the right order, your argument is laid out there before the examiner. They can see clearly what your argument is, they can see clearly what you're saying, and by bringing in evidence from what you've read to support what you're saying, you're demonstrating that what you're saying is not just based on your own ideas, but is also firmly rooted in what you've read. As I say, there is lots more really useful stuff. There's a very good thing on how to write an essay, for example, which I looked at a day or two ago, which mentioned some of this stuff, but lots more. So didn't want to go into too much detail today, but I hope that's helpful just as some sort of approach to making an argument clear, because that's something that I'm often asked about. Which I think then makes another opportunity for questions and answers, which might be about study skills, might be about what I've read, but also there's an opportunity here for any sort of questions that you might want to ask about the module more generally. I don't think there's anything in chat, but does anybody want to raise anything at this stage?
There's a question from Carrie from Bangor. What do you do after you've written out your statements and put them in order and realise there is a part you can't explain? would you research exhaustively until you can plug the gap, or would you skate over and hope for the best?
Okay. It would depend how late I was writing the essay, I think. And obviously, I didn't say that. I think there are two things. You come to a bit you can't explain, and provided you have time before you have to submit the essay, you would then research it more. But the other thing that you might do is ask yourself, well, if I can't explain it, actually, am I right about it? You know, perhaps this isn't as significant as I thought to the argument. When you're writing out these questions at the beginning, there may well be things that come into your head that you think it's important that you write about. But to my mind, once you've actually started writing, your ideas become clarified. And sometimes they are clarified and you think, yeah, I'm right now, that I understand it now. And sometimes you think, do you know, I actually don't understand it. I'm not sure that I'm right about that, and perhaps I'll just leave it out. So sometimes the answer may be leave it out. But if it's a crucial part of your argument and you just realize you haven't fully understood it, then it probably doesn't need a lot of extra research because you've got that idea from somewhere. But you do need to try and remember or go back into your notes and discover where you got that idea from and reread it and think to yourself, okay, now I hadn't fully understood it, but now I do. So now I can write it out in my own words. Now I can explain it because I've discovered I hadn't fully understood it. As I say, sometimes you may just think, oh, you may even think it's just not important. It may be right, but it's not important. But do not let yourself get to the point where you're leaving out a key step in your argument so that you're not taking people with you along the journey. If you think about argument as telling a story, you need to make sure that the steps that take you through from the beginning of the story to the end, actually you're not falling into some sort of chasm and having to crawl out of it somehow. Sorry, I think that picture probably is not the right image for it, but something like that. Anything else?
I don't know if you'd agree with me, Paula, but I wrote a little thing for like a midterm newsletter about writer's block. And I said, so sometimes if I sleep on something I don't understand, then I understand it in the morning. Or even if you can have a little power nap during the day, or even I get up and do the washing up, and the act of getting up and walking around then sometimes helps me understand something a bit better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember we had a session on reflection at one stage, and somebody said that they do their best thinking in the shower. And I've often thought since that actually it's that shower stage in reflection that we often leave out. We just sort of, you know, leap into reaching conclusions about things. And the same is true of essays. You just can't get your mind tied up in knots. Go and do something, go for a walk, have a sleep, have a shower, you know, cook a meal, just make a cup of tea even, but something that gets you away from where you are is usually really helpful.
I often find as well that it's that point when I've got up and I'm walking that I actually want to write something, so I carry a notebook with me or something, or write it into my phone.
Oh, that's very keen. I don't carry notebooks around with me, but you're right that sometimes ideas occur to you. Of course, you could be one of those people that wander around with a dictaphone. So whenever you have an idea, you just talk into your dictaphone. That's not me. It looks very professional to me, but I don't do it. Any other questions? Anything more generally about the module? I mean, I suppose you must be about halfway through.
I see Iris has her hand up.
We in our group we were discussing the talk about the Welsh language and the church and the Welsh language, and we wondered about our problem here in Tenby, which is known as Little England beyond Wales, because in fact they didn't speak English here since the 13th century, Welsh from the 13th century until it's been introduced in the schools as compulsory. So there aren't Welsh-speaking congregations, there are a lot of English incomers. Is that going to affect us at all when we're sort of looking at how we plan things for the future, that we're slightly different in our congregations? Does that make sense? In that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, I think this module talks about context.
Yes.
And there are several different contexts, really. And to a large extent, the module has dealt with a very broad context. So the context of Britain, to a lesser extent, the context of Wales. But when you're thinking particularly about your own reflections, and indeed when I hope that you will take some of the things that you've learned in this module through into your future life. Mm-hmm. And when you're doing that, the context that you will be dealing with is likely to be much narrower. It's your own particular context for the reflection. And that does mean that if you feel that your own particular context is relevant to what you're reflecting on, and that you might not have be the same in other places, just finding a very quick way of explaining what your context is will help your reflection, will help the reader to understand your reflection. But certainly when you're actually practically perhaps sitting down in a PCC meeting or talking in a discussion group about how your own ministry area might develop, it's that ministry area that matters, and your own context and your own community.
Yeah, the other thing I'm just branching on from that, is this reflection got to be very much concentrated on one thing, or can it be a little bit more general? What we're looking forward to the future?
Well, I think it needs to, it's very short.
Yes.
And it asks for one aspect, yes, of what you've learned. So I think you do need to start from there, and for your own sake, not open it up too broadly. Yeah. But your reflection doesn't have to be only about a very narrow aspect. It could be that thinking about a narrow aspect has made you reflect more broadly on something, and you know that could work, provided it makes good sense and it doesn't just sort of range vaguely over a lot of stuff without getting anywhere, if you know what I mean.
Yes, it's just looking at what the LMA could do to come together, that in some ways it's identifying maybe more than one thing. That's sort of been in the back of my mind.
Okay, well, start from one thing. Mm-hmm. Start from one aspect of this module. And then if you're applying that to the development of your ministry area or whatever, then try and make sure that it doesn't bring in a lot of other stuff at that stage, which just means that you can't see the wood for the trees. But certainly it could well be that you would want to, that it would affect a wider area than just that aspect. So, for example, you might be thinking about the role of the laity as one aspect of this module. And then if you were thinking about how that applied in the ministry area, as you were planning its future, you might find that it brought in aspects of, well, say, for example, if the digital ministry, you might feel that you're more likely to find a layperson in a ministry area who has got excellent digital skills than expecting that your poor old ministry area leader or parish priest is going to have all the skills that you need to do all the things that the ministry requires, you know. So you could well find that it leads you into a broader area in that way. Any other hands up?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. John has his hand up.
Carry on.
Yes, thank you very much for the two questions, really. Your PowerPoint slides that you've just shown us, I find them to be particularly interesting, but also something that I need to have a look at in a lot more detail. Will they be available for us?
I confess I have put together the two PowerPoints that I've used so far yesterday. So they haven't gone up onto Moodle yet, but they will.
Okay,
so
excellent.
They will be up on Moodle.
Excellent. And the second thing is that one of the purposes that, well, one of the things you've managed to achieve is make me panic.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, not at all, in a good way. But to realise, look, there's so much I need to learn on two topics. One is not just to learn everything, but also how to write it down at the end of all this. What's the recommendation in that you acquire the knowledge and then decide on the two important topics you want to at the end, or do you decide it some way during the course?
Okay, at this point, Manon closes her ears, because personally, I look at the assessment first thing and I decide what I want to write about first thing. And I'm afraid that apart from perhaps a small number of very general books, I concentrate my reading on the essay that I intend to write. This is a practical rather than an excellent scholarly answer, but that is how I do it. So I strongly advise you to get your ideas focused fairly early on. Then, you know, really enjoy the lectures, I hope. And they will give you lots of exciting ideas that you may want to come back to later, but concentrate your research on the areas that you want to write about in your essays.
You see, I haven't done that in the past. I've acquired all the knowledge and at the end of it, then decide, make a balanced decision. But I understand the wisdom of what you've just explained to me.
I'm a pragmatist, me.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, I think I make it about 20 to 4. I'm not sure when the rugby starts, but I'm not sure that we've got time for any teaching. However, there is a lovely lecture about Wales's delight in its Celtic past, which is sitting on Moodle for this session. Yeah, that's really, I think, a good place to stop at this stage. I can see somebody's asking whether all the books are available on Moodle. And the answer is that there are readings for every session which are available on Moodle. And there are some of the books on the book list are available electronically on Moodle, but not all of them, I'm afraid. Oh, hello, I'm sorry. I'm going to take a moment because I have just heard from a very old friend of mine that one of her neighbours is doing this course. And so I see that somebody, and I can't get at it now, it's disappeared into chat, but somebody has said hello from Wendy Dossett, and I would like to say hello back to Wendy Dossett, please. So everybody else, I apologise for that, but I'm grabbing my moment. Sorry, where were we? I think I was just finishing.
Yes, it was about the book. So we try and source all the
That's right.
books if we possibly can, don't we, and put them on Moodle.
Yeah. Yes, sorry. That was undisciplined.
And Ginny says the lecture on Celtic Christianity is really good.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so that's something for you to enjoy after Wales have won this afternoon. Have a little glass or something and then enjoy the lecture tonight.
Absolutely.
But oh, thank you ever so much, Paula. It's been a great session and it's been particularly helpful, I think, to go through the criteria. And I think that will be really helpful, not just for this module, but for you know, the other modules and the way that you looked at the reflective 1,000 words and everything, and how to construct an argument. Because I don't know, we feel that we need to put more and more energies into study skills, actually, because we think that it's really important. So we're going to we are going to move up that area up, because it's a bit hidden at the moment. So once we start to build up our resources, then we'll let you know where the study skills area is. But we're going to build a special area for it, I think. But just I know that so many people have said to me that they find the idea of constructing an argument difficult to get their heads around. They don't really understand what that means and everything. So the fact that you've done this here and gone through what you would write for as an essay has been extremely helpful, and I can see everybody's faces and everybody's agreeing with me. So thank you ever so much, Paula. It's been a great session. And,
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you. Okay. Goodbye, everybody, then.
Oh, if anybody wants
Thank you, Paula.
quick chat about anything practical, Lynn and I will be here for about 5 minutes if anybody's got any worries. Thank you ever so much, Paula. Thank you.